There is a particular kind of garden that does not exist much anymore. You used to see them everywhere, behind old farmhouses, along the edges of properties that had been in the same family for decades, spilling over wooden fences in neighborhoods where people had lived long enough to watch their children grow up, and their gardens grow old alongside them. Gardens that had not been redesigned or replanted in years. Gardens that simply kept going. What those gardens had that most modern gardens do not is what I would call plant memory. The knowledge, passed from neighbor to neighbor and grandmother to grandchild, of which plants you put in the ground once and never have to think about again. Not because they are boring. Not because they lack beauty, but because they were chosen by people who understood something that the garden center industry has spent 50 years trying to make us forget. The best plants are the ones that come back. Today, I want to bring back 9 of those plants. 9 perennials that were once so common in American gardens that people stopped noticing them, the way you stop noticing a beautiful view when you see it every day. Plants that fell out of fashion, not because anything was wrong with them, but because fashion moved on and took the gardening magazines with it. Plants that are now being rediscovered by gardeners who are tired of starting over every spring and are looking for something more like what their grandparents had, something permanent, something that builds on itself, something that comes back. Each one of these 9 plants has a story behind it, a reason it was beloved for generations before it fell out of the conversation, and a reason it belongs back in your garden this season. Some of them you may already know by name. Some of them you may recognize from a garden you visited as a child without knowing what you were looking at. Some of them may be completely new to you, which means you are about to meet plants that have been quietly waiting in the background of American horticultural history for someone to rediscover them. Let us start with the first one. Number 1 is bleeding heart. There was a time when almost every shaded side yard in America had a bleeding heart in it, and for good reason. Lamprocapnos spectabilis is one of the most visually distinctive plants in the entire perennial world. The flowers are not like anything else in a garden, arching stems hung with perfectly formed heart-shaped blooms in deep rose pink, with a small white inner petal that drops below the heart like a single suspended teardrop. When bleeding heart is in bloom in April and May, people stop on the sidewalk to look. They always have. They always will. Hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9. Partial to full shade with consistent moisture, particularly during the spring flowering period. Here is the piece of knowledge that every grandmother who grew bleeding heart knew, and that most modern gardeners discover the hard way. It goes completely summer dormant. When June arrives and the heat builds, the foliage yellows, declines, and eventually disappears entirely. The plant looks like it has died. It has not died. The root system is fully alive underground, resting through the heat exactly as it was biologically designed to do after thousands of years of evolution in cool woodland environments. It comes back in spring without fail. The old solution to the summer dormancy gap was simple and elegant. Plant bleeding heart alongside hostas, ferns, or astilbe. Those companions expand their foliage through early summer and fill in the space naturally, making the transition invisible. This is not a modern gardening hack. It is the wisdom that built those old gardens in the first place, passed down because it worked. Number 2 is Baptisia, and this one is perhaps the most forgotten plant on this entire list, which is remarkable given what it does. Blue false indigo produces tall, upright flower spikes of deep, true, saturated indigo blue in May and June. Not blue-purple, not lavender blue. Actual blue. The kind of saturated, remarkable blue that is genuinely rare in the flowering perennial world, rising on stems that can reach 4 feet. Making it one of the most architecturally dramatic spring perennials available to American gardeners. After the flowers fade, inflated charcoal black seed pods form and rattle audibly in autumn breezes, providing a second season of ornamental interest that is completely unique in the perennial world. Hardy, in zones 3 through 9. Full sun to light shade. Average to poor, well-draining soil. Like Russian sage, Baptisia actively performs better in lean soil than in heavily amended beds. It is also a nitrogen fixer, forming a symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria that allows it to pull nitrogen from the air and deposit it in a form that surrounding plants can use. Planting Baptisia improves the soil around it over time. There is one thing about Baptisia that requires patience and rewards it generously. It takes 3 full years to reach its flowering potential. Year 1, it establishes its root system underground while producing modest above-ground growth that does not suggest what is coming. Year 2, it grows noticeably larger, but still holds back its full display, as if it knows something you do not yet. Year 3, it blooms in a way that makes every single day of waiting feel like the most worthwhile patience you have exercised in your garden. The bloom display in Year 3 from a well-placed baptisia is genuinely one of the most satisfying moments in perennial gardening, and then it does it again for the next 30 years, without being replaced, without being divided, and without asking anything from you beyond the patience of those first 3 seasons. Baptisia plants 40 years old are documented across America, still blooming reliably in the same spot where someone planted them decades ago. Do not move it. Do not divide it. Do not lose patience in Year 2 and dig it up. Plant it, leave it completely alone, and give it 3 springs. What it gives you in return is a lifetime. Number 3 is peony, and if there is one plant on this list that truly represents the word heirloom, it is the peony. Paeonia lactiflora varieties have been cultivated for centuries in China and have been growing in American gardens since the colonial era. There are peonies still blooming today in New England gardens that were planted by great-great-grandparents. The plant outlives the person who planted it. That is not a metaphor. That is a documented horticultural reality. The blooms are extraordinary by any standard. Large, full, fragrant flowers in white, cream, soft pink, deep rose, and rich red, some fully double with hundreds of petals, some single with golden centers, some semi-full and cupped in a way that looks almost too perfect to be natural. The fragrance carries across a yard on a still May morning. Hardy in USDA zones 3 through 8. Full sun, rich well-draining soil. Here is the care detail that every experienced peony grower knows. Plant the eyes, the reddish buds at the top of the root, no more than 1 to 2 inches below the soil surface. Deeper than that and the plant blooms poorly, or not at all. That single detail has frustrated more peony growers than any other factor, and it is the entire difference between a peony that blooms spectacularly and one that produces only foliage. One more thing. Peonies need winter cold to bloom well. Specifically, they require a period of temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit for several weeks to trigger the biological processes that produce the following season's flowers. In zones 8 through 10, the required chilling hours may not be met in mild winters and bloom can be unreliable. For gardeners in zones 3 through 7, which includes the vast majority of the American gardening population, this is the ultimate long-term plant. Plant it once. Choose the location carefully because it does not like to be moved. Give it full sun and rich, well-draining soil, and then commit to it. The peony rewards commitment with blooms that become more spectacular, more fragrant and more abundant with every passing decade. A peony planting that looks good at 5 years looks extraordinary at 20. That is the kind of relationship with a garden that most modern plants simply cannot offer. Number 4 is foxglove, and specifically the perennial varieties rather than the common biennial. Digitalis grandiflora yellow foxglove and Digitalis X mertenensis strawberry foxglove are the perennial members of the foxglove family that most gardeners have never encountered because the common biennial Digitalis purpurea is what fills the garden center shelves. But these perennial foxgloves do what the biennial cannot. They come back. Digitalis grandiflora produces soft, creamy yellow tubular bells with brown interior spotting from June through August. Elegant and understated in a way that suits the old-fashioned cottage garden perfectly. Hardy in zones 3 through 8. Partial shade to full shade in hotter regions. Self-seeds reliably, meaning the colony gently expands on its own each season. Digitalis X mertenensis produces larger, warmer, strawberry pink to rose-colored bells that are more visually bold than the yellow species and bloom in the same period. Hardy in zones 4 through 8. Both attract hummingbirds and are beloved by bumblebees whose bodies fit perfectly into the tubular flowers. One important safety note. All foxglove species contain cardiac glycosides that are toxic if ingested. This has always been known and respected by gardeners who grew foxglove for centuries alongside it as an essential cottage garden plant. Keep it out of reach of young children and do not plant it where grazing animals have access to it. The plant itself is not aggressive. The toxicity is only a concern if the plant material is consumed. Number 5 is monkshood, aconitum, and this is the plant that fills a gap that almost nothing else in the perennial world addresses. Aconitum carmichaeli blooms in September and October, producing tall spikes of deep violet blue hooded flowers, the shape that gives the plant its common name, at the exact point in the gardening year, when most other perennials have finished their season. In an old-fashioned garden where the goal was color from April through October, monkshood was the non-negotiable final act. Hardy in zones 3 through 8. Partial shade to full shade. Consistent moisture. The deep violet-blue color in those hooded blooms is one of the richest and most saturated flower colors available in the fall garden anywhere in American horticulture. It pairs naturally with the golds and ambers of fall, creating combinations that look like they belong in a painting. Like foxglove, all parts of monkshood are toxic if ingested and should be kept away from young children and animals. Gardeners who grew monkshood for generations understood this the same way they understood which mushrooms to pick and which to leave. It is knowledge, not danger, and that knowledge lives in the garden alongside the plant. Number 6 is hollyhock. Alsia rosea is the plant that defined the American cottage garden for a century, and still does in the gardens of gardeners who remember what cottage gardens were actually built to look like. Tall, vertical, architectural spires of bloom rising to 6, 8, even 10 feet against fences, walls, and outbuildings in July and August. Single flowers in deep burgundy, rich pink, soft apricot, pure white, near black, and bicolors that no modern annual can replicate. The classic hollyhock is technically a biennial in most climates, blooming in its second year and then seeding itself so prolifically that a hollyhock planting becomes essentially self-perpetuating. Plant it once, and it never completely leaves. Hardy in zones 3 through 9. Full sun. Well-draining soil amended with compost at planting gives the plant the nutrient base it needs to build those tall flower spikes reliably. Rust fungus is the most common challenge, appearing as orange spots on the lower leaves in humid conditions. The old solution, practiced by gardeners for over a century, is removing affected lower leaves promptly when you notice them, improving air circulation around the base by not crowding other tall plants too closely, and watering at the base rather than from overhead. Rust rarely affects the upper flowering stems and does not stop bloom production. The old gardeners who grew hollyhocks for decades simply accepted the lower leaf rust as part of the plant's character and enjoyed the spectacular upper bloom regardless. Modern rust-resistant varieties like Halo Series and Queenie Purple exist and are worth seeking out for gardens in particularly humid climates where rust pressure is consistent. Number 7 is Echinacea, coneflower, but specifically the heritage varieties rather than the modern cultivated hybrids. Magnus Purple, the variety that won Perennial Plant of the Year in 1998, is as close to the original prairie coneflower as a named cultivar gets. Large swept-back purple petals surrounding a raised bronze dome center, blooming from July through September, self-seeding generously, attracting monarchs, swallowtails, and goldfinches, and providing architectural winter interest through its dried seed heads for months after the flowers have finished. Hardy in zones 3 through 9. Full sun to light shade. Poor to average soil. The thing that made coneflower a staple of old-fashioned gardens was not just its beauty, but its independence. Plant it once, and it expands quietly on its own, filling in its designated space through root growth and gentle self-seeding, until it has created a naturalized planting that looks like it has always been there. Leave the seed heads standing through winter, without exception. In old gardens, this was not a decision. It was simply what you did. The birds needed them and the garden looked better for it. Number 8 is globe thistle, echinops, and this plant belongs on this list specifically because it represents a category of beauty that modern gardens have largely abandoned in favor of softness, roundness, and the familiar. Globe thistle is architectural in a way that is completely its own. Echinops retro produces perfect steel blue spherical flower heads, 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter, on branching stems above deeply divided silver-green foliage. The geometric perfection of those spheres is genuinely arresting in a garden context. They look designed rather than grown. Hardy in zones 3 through 9. Full sun. Poor, dry, well-draining soil where it thrives with genuine independence. It tolerates drought to a remarkable degree and performs better in lean, unamended conditions than in rich, fertilized beds, where it tends to grow too tall and require staking. Deer-resistant because of the spiny foliage. Bees are drawn to globe thistle in extraordinary numbers during bloom, which runs from July through August, and the steel blue spherical heads are among the most photographed flowers in any cottage garden where they appear. The dried flower heads hold their perfect spherical shape through fall and winter. In old cottage gardens, globe thistle was grown both for the garden and for the house, the dried stems keeping their extraordinary steel blue color for months in indoor arrangements long after the garden season had ended. That dual-purpose quality, beautiful in the ground and beautiful cut and dried, made it a plant that practical, resourceful gardeners kept year after year. It deserves to come back into the gardens of gardeners who value both beauty and usefulness in the same plant. Number 9 is Veronicastrum, Culver's root, and this is the plant that experienced gardeners who specialize in old-fashioned and heritage perennials consistently name as the most underused, most underappreciated plant in American horticulture. Veronicastrum virginicum is native to North American prairies and woodlands, and was a fixture of American cottage gardens and farmstead plantings from the colonial era through the early 20th century, before almost completely disappearing from mainstream cultivation. It produces tall, elegant candelabra-like stems with multiple wands of tiny white or soft lavender flowers, rising from a single plant to 5 or 6 feet. Hardy in zones 3 through 8. Full sun to partial shade with consistent moisture. The bloom period runs from July through September. The seed heads that follow the flowers are slim and architectural, and provide winter interest in the garden while feeding birds through the cold months. Pollinators of almost every species, bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, and beneficial wasps, work the flowers continuously throughout the bloom period. What Veronicastrum does better than any other tall perennial in this category is create vertical grace. Not the stiff verticality of a poker-straight spike, but the soft, arching, candelabra quality of something that moves gently in a breeze while holding its structure completely. In an old-fashioned mixed border where texture and form mattered as much as color, and where the interplay between different plant heights and habits was considered as important as flower selection, Veronicastrum was invaluable as a back-of-border vertical element that brought elegance without weight. It still performs that role with the same quiet authority. It simply stopped being sold because it does not make a spectacular show in a 4-inch pot on a garden center table, and the modern retail garden industry has very little patience for plants that require seeing in a mature border to understand. Seek it out from specialty nurseries, from native plant sales, or from gardeners who still grow it. Once you see it in a border at full height and full bloom, moving in a summer breeze with bees working every wand of flowers, you will understand immediately why it was in every serious cottage garden for 2 centuries before it disappeared. Here is what these 9 plants have in common beyond their old-fashioned origins. They were all chosen by gardeners who understood that a garden is not a seasonal installation. It is a living relationship between a person and a piece of ground that develops over time. Every plant that comes back every year without being replanted is a gift forward, to next spring's self, to next decade's self, to whoever tends that ground after you are gone. The gardeners who planted Baptisia 40 years ago did not know who would be standing in front of it 4 decades later watching it bloom. They planted it anyway. The peonies that are blooming right now in gardens across New England were planted by people who are no longer alive to see them. That kind of permanence is something that a flat of annuals cannot create. These 9 plants are invitations back into that tradition, not nostalgia for its own sake, but recognition that what our grandparents and great-grandparents planted in their gardens represented genuine horticultural wisdom that is worth recovering. Plant one this season. Give it time. Come back to it next year and the year after and the year after that. Watch what happens to a garden when you stop starting over every spring and start building something instead. The first year it looks like a beginning. The second year, it starts to look like a garden. By the 5th year, it starts to look inevitable, like it was always supposed to look exactly this way. By the 10th year, it starts to look like it was always there. That is what these plants do. That is what old gardens were built on, and it is available to anyone willing to choose differently at the garden center this spring, to walk past the flat of annuals and pick up a Baptisia, a peony, a globe thistle, a Veronicastrum, something that does not look impressive right now but carries 30 years of beauty in a 4-inch pot. Drop a comment telling me which of these 9 plants you remember from a childhood garden or a grandmother's yard, and what USDA zone or state you are gardening in. I read every single comment. Give this a thumbs up if it brought back something you had forgotten, and subscribe for perennial gardening content every week that connects the best of old garden wisdom with the best of what we know today. Now go plant something that outlasts you.